get the actual test to you at the end of class. Anything else I want to mention? Oh, yes. So the other day we met in the library. Whoops, I'm almost falling over. It's Thursday. I woke up today and I'm like, Thursday, because every day this week I've gotten up and I'm like, oh, it's Thursday. No, it's not. It's nice. Oh, it's Thursday. No, it's so today is actually Thursday. I'm very excited about it. So Tuesday, we met in the library, and I told you at the end to have a piece of paper that told me what you think you are going, who you think you are going to be for your research paper. So if you have that, please make sure that your name is on it and pass it to me as the roads. Any other?
It's too, I have limited resources.
All right, so let's start on the Americas. And I do have an activity. I think I told you at the beginning of the course that at least once a unit we would have an activity to do. I would show you something and you would get the groups and have study questions, and that is true of today. And this particular activity involves the Mayan civilization. Very interesting group. So we'll get started on that in just a minute. But before we get started on that, let's talk about the Americas kind of in general and some of those early civilizations, just to kind of get those into your notes. So I'm not going to say too much about them, but just to kind of get a sense of the history of the civilizations as they develop in the Americas. And it's interesting because when we talk about the peopling of the Americas, we talk about a number of different places. So I have up here the Gulf of Mexico. We're going to spend a lot of time on this particular region. And by the way, the peoples that peopled this particular region, sometimes we refer to them collectively as Amerindians. Amerindians. So if you see this word, maybe in your textbook or in other readings or whatever, that's what that's referring to. So collectively, those individuals who inhabited Central America, that place right in there, Gulf of Mexico region, they were referred to as the Amerindians. Okay. So how do we get people on the American continents? Actually, we think that comes fairly late in the game. Bering Strait, that's of course the obvious thing. This was iced over about 12 or 15,000 years ago. It's this strip of water between what is present-day Russia and what is present-day Alaska. That was iced over. People followed food, sort of nomadic tribes, and they eventually stepped foot on the American continents and spread out. But we're starting to piece together other parts of that story. That we know probably happened. We have evidence to suggest that it happened, but we're starting to see other parts of that puzzle emerge. For instance, in Cactus Hill, Virginia, we have some excavations that suggest that people were there before the Bering Strait, about 30,000-ish years ago or so. I have no idea how they got there. We haven't figured that out yet. But we're starting to piece this together. But what we do know is that there are going to be people on the American continents fairly late, at least historically speaking, fairly late. And because they arrive fairly late, the development into civilization, the development into settled civilization groups tends to be late as well. And I'll give you some numbers on this in just a minute. So what are some of the first groups that we see? Well, one of the first groups that we see, one of those first Amerindian civilizations, the Olmecs. And we can date the Olmecs from about 1500 to about 400 BCE. So 1500-ish to 400 BCE. And by the way, they're famous for these faces, which are pretty great, by the way. Very characteristic of the Olmecs, and they've got some great personality. So I love the faces up there. It's pretty great. But the Olmecs, and you can kind of see, so here's the Gulf of Mexico, there's the Pacific Ocean, Valley of Mexico. So this land right in here, the Mayans, of course, going to be up here in the Yucatan Peninsula. But the Olmecs, this is referred to on the map as Olmec Heartland, but the Olmecs are going to be right in here. So right in that little strip of land. Whoops. No, go backwards. There we go. See the Olmecs. We know a bit about the Olmecs. We obviously know that they created art, that we find, that we see. We know that they have a written language. We can't decipher that, so we don't exactly know what's going on. So much easier if you can decipher a written language, right? We'll talk about that. Because then you can read what they had to say. Well, we can't unfortunately read what the Olmecs had to say, but we do know that they had a written language. We do know that they had extensive trade. They're pretty centrally located for that. And all of these different civilizations that we're going to talk about, the Amerindian civilizations, they're pretty centrally located for trade. Gulf of Mexico, pretty good place if you're going to engage in some extensive trade. The other thing that we know about the Olmecs, we actually see this in some other Amerindian civilizations, they like to play a specific kind of game where they would have this ball made out of hardened sap, and they would use it to play, well, not exactly baseball, not exactly soccer, but like a combination, if you will, of those. And it could actually be, I'm sorry.
Oh, is it baseball, soccer?
Baseball, well, they don't have a bat, they don't have, I mean, it's, again, it could be an actually fairly dangerous game because the ball was made out of rubber and sap from a rubber tree. So it was a fairly hard ball and it hit you in the head, it could cause some damage. But we see that kind of game throughout that area and in later civilizations, but the Olmecs are going to have it fairly early on. The Olmecs will decline and disappear by about 400 BCE, about 400 BCE, and the reasons for their decline probably included resources and war. We don't have a whole lot of evidence to suggest anything beyond that. Those are some pretty primary reasons why any civilization declines. And we think that the Olmec civilization will decline because of those things. So resources, lack of resources, or overuse of resources, and war. The Zapotecs. So the Zapotecs, again, that region right in here, it's kind of circled for you where the Zapotecs are going to, and you don't need to, it's fuzzy, I know. That's okay, you don't need to know the names of those surrounding locations. This is just to give you an idea of where they're located in that Gulf of Mexico region. So the Zapotecs are going to be about 400 BCE to about 700 CE. Notice that as the Olmecs decline, the Zapotecs are going to take over, and they're roughly in the same region. Yes?
400 BC to what CE?
700 CE. So 400 BCE to 700 CE. So the Zapotecs in that particular region. The Zapotecs are known for building pyramid-like structures, which are really interesting because when we talk about those kinds of structures, obviously we saw pyramids in Egypt. Now these pyramids are going to be a bit different. Egypt is known for those smooth-sided pyramids. These pyramids are going to be a bit different. They're going to be more step ish, but they're still pyramids, and we see them in different parts of the world, and certainly we see them in these Amerindian civilizations.
Do they use them as tools?
In part, but also religious reasons as well. Yeah. And that was true in Egypt. That was true in Egypt. And really, when we think about the pyramids in Egypt, there aren't very many of them. When we look at the Amerindian civilizations, oh my goodness, they're all over the place. So they built an awful lot of them. Egypt, not so much, but the Amerindian civilizations, we have them, bless you, and not only the different groups that we see, but even like within the Mayan civilization, we're gonna have them all over the place. So they were prolific pyramid builders, if you want to think of them that way. And finally, the Teotihuacans. This group in particular is going to influence a later group that we commonly refer to as the Aztec. I don't know that we're gonna get to the Aztec today. We might have to save that for next week. But they are gonna be about 40 miles outside of present-day Mexico City. That is roughly where the Aztec are eventually going to settle, although much later. And the Aztec, when they do settle there, they have these pyramid structures. That was the famous Teotihuacan pyramid, Pyramid of the Sun. That pyramid and that civilization will very much influence what the Aztec are going to do in terms of building and going to believe as well. So the Teotihuacan civilization, roughly 100 BCE to 500-ish CE. 100 BCE to 500-ish CE. And again, very much influenced the Aztec, yes.
Is that where the pyramids are in Tulum, Mexico, or is that?
They're,
That area?
yes, but they're also all over
Oh, okay.
as well. That particular pyramid of the sun is the most famous and the biggest. But yeah, they're all over, and including
I was just curious. Yeah, when I was really young, so I couldn't remember what the people were. they were talking
yeah,
about.
and it's that general area.
Oh.
Yeah. All right, so one of the other things that's important to kind of think about, because as we get into different civilizations, especially in different parts of the world, one of the things that I like to do is to compare what's going on in these civilizations and what's going on in these civilizations, and where can we find similarities and where can we find differences. So if we look at Amerindian civilizations just in general and compare them to civilizations that we see in Asia, let's talk about those comparisons. First of all, one of the biggest similarities that we see between these Amerindian civilizations and those civilizations in Asia, both places we start to see, as we see the civilization grow and develop, they began as shrine centers linked by religion, linked by shamans, or persons who spoke to spirits on behalf of communities. So they're like the early priests, if you will, or the early religious leaders, if you will. So they began as shrine centers linked by shamans, but they're eventually going to develop into city-states. Now, when we talked about Greece, we saw city-states. We see city-states in Mesopotamia. Well, we also see city-states in many of these Amerindian civilizations as well. Pyramids, we talked about, so there are some agricultural. Yeah. There are some architectural, how to get the right word, similarities that we see. So building those kinds of structures, and even in ancient Mesopotamia, when we talked about how that civilization developed, you saw those kind of pyramid-like structures that eventually become known as the ziggurats, right? So we see those kinds of structures in other places, and we're certainly going to see them in the Amerindian civilizations. However, there are a lot of differences. There are a lot of differences between these Amerindian civilizations and other civilizations, which make the Amerindian civilizations pretty unique in some ways. So one of the differences is that when we look at other civilizations civilizations around the world, like Mesopotamia, like Egypt, like China, early Chinese civilizations, they grow up around major bodies of water. The Yellow and the Yangtze rivers, the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates. When we look at the Americas, there are civilizations that grow up around major bodies of water, the Amazon, for instance, or the Mississippi. But not all of them. Not all of them. That doesn't mean that they're not next to water, but they're not necessarily next to large bodies of water like those navigable rivers. So they're in the Gulf of Mexico, or they're in a swampy region, or they have rivers, but they're not major rivers like the Nile would be, for instance. So that makes these civilizations unique. The other difference between the Amerindians and other civilizations, the Amerindians did not tend to use metal in their tools. They used it in their jewelry, but they don't necessarily use it in their tools, or in all of their tools. When we talk about the Mayans, for instance, we're going to talk about how the Mayans, one of their biggest trade commodities was something called obsidian, which is this volcanic rock that tends to be quite flaky. So you can break it, but what it'll do is to create this very sharp edge, and that was used as a tool. So they don't necessarily use metal in their tools.
What if they use instead?
I just told you.
Obsidian, oh, okay, I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. So other kinds of things, other kinds of materials that they might have, yeah. One of the other things that's interesting, Amerindian civilizations don't have beasts of burden. We don't see horses come to the Americas until the Spanish come over in the 16th century, well, 15th century, late 15th century. We don't see horses, we don't see other beasts of burden come over until the Spanish establish contact, until other Europeans establish contact with the Americas. They did have llamas in some places, not in all places, llamas are in the Andes, but they don't have beast of burden, and they don't have the wheel, which is kind of interesting. They either carried things, moved things another way, we'll talk about some ways when we get to the Aztecs, or they carried things on canoes. So if they're living near the Gulf of Mexico, that would be really easy to do. They don't have wheels. Yes.
Can you like domesticate, like you can domesticate llamas and have them like.
Sure, and they did.
Okay.
Yeah, they did. So they did use that. But even then, I mean, llamas versus oxen,
Yeah.
it's a bit different. And llamas are only in the Andes, so it's not like they're going to spread to other places. But yes, they did utilize llamas for certain things, yeah. Is that the right word? Utilize? I think so. We'll go with that. The other interesting thing, some of these civilizations, some of these Amerindian civilizations are gonna have writings. Some are not. Some are not. The Mayans do. The Inca don't. So there aren't gonna be writings in all civilizations. As one historian put it, some of these civilizations that we see in the Americas have, quote, 1 foot in the Stone Age. 1 foot in the Stone Age. We see the domestication of plants quite late in the Americas, about 5000 BCE. Villages about 3000 BCE. Pottery about 2300 BCE. Population increases, so that indicates settled agriculture and that sort of thing, about 500 BCE. It's later. And that kind of makes sense, because if people didn't come to the continents until later, it's gonna take a little time for them to get started. But it is later, because if we look at China, for instance, we see civilizations all the way back to 8,000 years ago. They already had pottery, they already had settled civilizations well before any of these American civilizations are going to form. So it's just later that we see these civilizations. Yes.
Could you repeat those? Do we need to
Oh,
know
sure.
those?
Well, you know, I mean, I can repeat them so you can get them down in your notes.
I didn't
but
know if we need,
No, you don't need to memorize
Oh,
the
okay.
names. But, domestication of plants, 5,000 BCE. Villages, 3,000 BCE. Pottery, 2,300 BCE. And population increase about 500 BCE. Okay. Let's see here. Let's talk about the Mayans. There they are. The Mayans are going to settle on Yucatan Peninsula, modern day Guatemala. Modern day Guatemala. I mentioned one of their biggest trade commodities, that was obsidian. Talked about the use of that. But the other big trade commodity that they're going to have, that would be cocoa beans. Now, interestingly enough, when we think of cocoa, when I think of cocoa, I think probably the same thing you think of, which is what? Chocolate, yeah, awesome. Except no. So chocolate is, of course, going to come from cocoa, but it comes after the Spanish come over and get those beans and take them back to Europe and actually give them to Spanish monks. Spanish monks get the idea that if you brown this stuff down and you add cream and you add sugar, it creates something that's pretty awesome. But they did have cocoa, and this was considered an important commodity within Mayan civilization. They're going to use it as currency, so they'll use the beans as currency. They are going to also use it either in what we would today consider sort of like a mole sauce, or they ground the beans down and used it in a very bitter drink that was famous amongst aristocrats. So only the wealthiest class, because they used it as currency, only the wealthiest classes could have that kind of beverage. The other interesting thing about Mayan civilization, and you can kind of see this on the map, it's divided into different city-states, and there were about 40 of them. There were about 40 of those Mayan city-states. They're not all gonna get along. Just like in ancient Greece, some of them will get along, some of them won't. And so off and on throughout Mayan civilization, there's gonna be warfare between those groups. When they're fighting over resources, when they're fighting over land, there's warfare between those groups. We know that they had a hierarchy, just like the Greeks, just like some of the other civilizations that we've talked about. They have a king at the top of that hierarchy within each one of those city-states, so they'll have a ruler. Underneath that, they'll have landed aristocrats. Landed aristocrats, and underneath that, they'll have the merchants and the scribes and those kinds of what we might consider sort of middle-class peoples. And then underneath that, there's everybody else. And I put this picture up here. Obviously, this is not from ancient Mayan civilization, but I put it up here because it's interesting. When we're looking at these Amerindian civilizations, some of the cultural aspects of those civilizations survive in the places where those civilizations were in the present day. So one of the things that we are going to see with the Mayans is that they lived in, most of those individuals lived in fairly simple homes where you would see the thatched roof, because that's a resource that they have. And so in some ways, it's a very renewable resource. So they lived in those thatched roofs. They did have a division of labor. It was considered appropriate for men to go out and farm, men to go out and hunt, and women stayed at home and ground the cornmeal for food. That was one of their staples, cornmeal. The land that we're talking about, let me go back to this map for just a minute. So the Yucatan Peninsula, it was a very swampy area, but some of the land on the Yucatan Peninsula is very dry. So it's kind of this study in contrast, if you will. You have very swampy areas and then you have very dry areas. So one of the things that we think the Mayans did in order to provide themselves with available farmland, because you can't necessarily farm on the swampy area, but you can't necessarily farm in the dry, rocky area either. So one of the things that we think that they did was to create a kind of irrigation system that we eventually refer to as swamp agriculture. So they would take all of this water from the swampy area, build irrigation ducts, and use that water to irrigate the very dry, rocky areas so that they could farm. Now, eventually, mud and silt and all kinds of stuff is going to build up in those irrigation pipes. So what they'll do is to scrape those out occasionally and use that as soil for those very dry areas so that they could renew that farmland. Dominic?
When did they start their civilization? I guess what dates did they begin?
The beginning date is a little tougher to kind of pin down, but it's gonna be, they're going to last until about the 10th century CE. And then they'll die out. Now, the Mayan people are still gonna be around, but the civilization died out about the 10th century, 10th, 11th century, somewhere around there. So actually, when the Europeans show up, the Mayan civilization, those city-states aren't necessarily going to be around. The people will, but that developed civilization is not around. Does that make sense? Yeah. Another kind of agriculture that they used, and this was not an advantage for them, is slash and burn agriculture. That tends to be very harsh on an environment, and we do have evidence to suggest that they did use that. And actually, one of the things that contributes to the end of the Mayan civilization, overuse of resources. And if you're using slash and burn agriculture quite a bit, that's probably going to contribute to that. Alrighty, any questions thus far? Oh, when I say that they had a stratified society, actually one of the things that's kind of interesting, so if you look at the urban centers of each of these city-states, it's divided by class as well. So all of the merchants were supposed to inhabit one part of that urban center. So kind of think of it like a strip mall. All of the merchants were supposed to be in that location so that everybody who needed to do business or buy stuff or whatever could go there, and they knew it was there. So all of these city-states functioned in that interesting kind of layout, in that interesting kind of way. Alrighty, so some of the city-states are a bit more famous than others. When we're talking about the Mayan city-states, there are a couple that kind of stand out: Tikal and Palenque. Tikal and Palenque. Tikal is known for something called the Temple of the Giant Jaguar, which is interesting. Interesting name, but the Temple of the Giant Jaguar, which was 150 feet high and built by quite a bit of, quite a large number of Mayans. And as far as we can tell, Mayans did think that it wasn't the height of the structure, it wasn't the grandiose nature of the structure, it was how much human labor went into building that structure. So the more human labor you had, the more magnificent that structure was, because it was almost like, hey, hard work, this is important to us. So the more hard work you put into something, the more valuable it is to that particular society. So Temple of the Jaguar, where is it? Hold on. Let me get it in the right order. The Temple of the Giant Jaguar, I need that. The Temple of the Giant Jaguar, famous to Tikal. Palenque, that is famous because of a particular king named Pakal. We know about Pakal because at some point we decipher Mayan hieroglyphs. Go back to this little thing, just right here to give you a sense of what those Mayan hieroglyphs look like. For the longest time, we could not decipher their language. We could not read it. That's because when Spanish priests come over, they see it as pagan and have every little bit of it burned. But the writings on those Mayan temples remained because they're stone and they don't burn. So it took code breakers into the 1960s to study the Mayan language and to figure it out. And it's a fairly complex language. It's a very complex language, not very complex language. Because not only did each one of those hieroglyphs indicate a word or an idea or phrase, but if you put two different hieroglyphs together, it no longer indicates that idea or word or phrase. It indicates different parts of words that together create another word, like a totally different word. So it's pictorial and phonetic at the same time. And it was very difficult to figure out, but we did. We figured it out. And so when we started to read what was written on those Mayan temples, that was just this wonderful moment in history because we could read what the Mayans had to say, knew more about their history, knew more about their society, knew more about their religion, and especially at Palenque, knew more about this guy named Pakal, who's a pretty important guy. So according to these Mayan hieroglyphs, Pakal becomes king when he's 12, so fairly young. His mother will rule as regent for 10 years until he reaches the age of maturity. Apparently he liked her because he made her a goddess. But of course, if he made her a goddess, what does that make him? Son of a goddess, so that makes him a god, right? So there's kind of something that he gets as well. Palenque was especially important, not only because of Pakal's leadership, and he helped to sort of build up Palenque as one of those major city-states, but also because it's an area where you see a lot of that swampy land, but also underwater aqueducts. And this is important when trying to understand the Mayan religion. The Mayan religion was this very interesting religion. And it has something to do with those aqueducts, but I don't want to say too much because we're about to watch that film that I want to show you so you can get into groups and talk about the Mayan religion. But what I will say is that the Mayans do, if you're wondering, because we talk about it when we get to the Aztecs, they do practice human sacrifice, so that is something that the Mayans do. For a long time, we didn't know if that was the case, but then we found this big pit, and they drained it, and they found all of these human bones in this pit that had been from. Like, oh yeah, okay. Human sacrifice, fine. So a lot of these Amerindian civilizations that we're going to talk about do have an element of human sacrifice, and we'll talk more about that. But now is a perfect time to get that video started. Let me get it started. And by the way, what I will say, it's a great video. I love showing it. One, because you get to see about the Mayan religion. You get to see the geography as well. So you get to see the land. So you get to see modern day Guatemala and modern day Yucatan Peninsula, but you can kind of put yourself back in time and see what the Mayans saw. And I think that's really instructive to students as well. I'm gonna let you watch this film and then I will pass out the, if we have time, yeah, we'll have time. I'll pass out the sheets of paper and we may not get to the group work until Tuesday, but that's okay. So let me get this started. And by the way, the guy who narrates this is Goofy. He's goofy as all get out. Just get past that.
This week, we're exploring the mystery of the Maya pyramids. The Maya were the greatest pyramid builders of the ancient world. The Egyptians built fewer than 100. The Maya built thousands. Every Maya town and city had its own pyramid. Why? Could it be the pyramid of one great Maya king holds the key? We're about to find out.
He made his journey into the underworld. Right, this is the entrance. Or the exit.
Our quest will take us deep into the mountains and jungles of Central America. Hold on to your hats, it's gonna be one wild ride. I'll be whitewater kayaking on remote mountain rivers in Guatemala and diving into the flooded underground caves of Mexico. We're digging for the truth, and we're going to extremes to do it.
Ready for the plunge? Ready for the plunge, baby.
The ancient Maya built thousands of these amazing structures all over Central America. We know that pyramids were the center of Maya life, but what we don't know is why.
To find out, we're going to visit one of the greatest Maya pyramids ever built and learn about the extraordinary man who created it, King Pakal the Great. Our quest will start in the city Pakal built in southern Mexico, Palenque. And I've got a lot of airports to get through on the way.
New one. Just in case I lose the old one. Four people, 4 flights, 17 bags. I'm excited. I want to see every room. I want to see the Tomb of Inscriptions. I want to see all the palaces at Palenque. I have some questions I definitely like to get answers to. But to be about 10 miles away, this is a journey of a lifetime.
Tomorrow morning, I'm finally going to explore the place I've been waiting to get to all these years, Palenque.
It's dawn. The jungle is coming alive. And everywhere are the most amazing ruins. Years ago, the city's most famous ruler, Pakal the Great, built the most beautiful temples the Mayan world has ever seen.
From 632 to 683 AD, while Europe was still in the Dark Ages, the Maya world was flourishing, and Pakal was creating this great city. They say he was a ruthless warlord, but he must have been a great architect too. Even in ruins, his city is incredibly impressive. As I walk around the ancient palace, I try to imagine what this city was like in Pakal's day. The crowds of Maya warriors, the traders, and the nobles he would have seen as he walked around Palenque back in the 7th century. Pakal planned the entire city, but he saved his greatest creation for last. The astonishing pyramid built to commemorate his own death, the Temple of the Inscriptions. It's the biggest tomb created for a single man anywhere in the ancient Americas. I've come here to meet Mexican archaeologist Alfonso Morales, who's a well-known expert on Pakal.
Alfonso? Hi, I'm Josh. Victor, what's your business?
As we climb the 69 steps of Pakal's tomb, Alfonso explains to me that when Pakal built this pyramid, he believed he was building a sacred mountain.
You're trying to build a mountain, he said? Mm-hmm. Well, why build a mountain here, though? And there's a mountain right there.
I think he wanted to create some cave to put his tomb inside.
His own cave.
The caves are normally a place where you go to the underworld, where you can talk to the gods, and the place where you start your trip to the other world.
So there's a cave inside here?
Yes, to understand it, we need to go inside and take a look at it.
An artificial mountain with a cave in it, an entry to the underworld. Were these somehow the keys to Pakal's pyramid? Fortunately, there are hieroglyphs that tell Pakal's story. And when archaeologists finally broke the Maya code, they read of a strange underworld journey that Pakal's spirit would take after his death. It started from a cave in a mountain.
And this is it.
Yes, this is the most sacred place at Palenque. The entrance to the underworld. So we'll go down to Pakal's tomb.
Lead the way.
The stairway seems to go down into the blackness forever. It's narrow and steep, and the limestone steps are slick with condensation. It would be all too easy to slip. and it's a long, long way to the bottom. It really feels like I'm going down into the underworld. And Alfonso tells me the Maya were obsessed with the underworld. It was their gateway to immortality. Pakal believed that after he died, he journeyed for 2.5 years, meeting the gods and demons of creation along the way. He was sure he'd finally be reborn as a god himself. Finally, we get to the bottom of the stairway and find the tomb.
This is his cave.
This is the famous cave of Palenque.
And there's a sarcophagus. Amazing. And from here, he made his journey into the underworld.
Right, this is the entrance, or the exit to the underworld. Yeah. And his body is here. His soul or his spirit is already gone to the other side of the cave.
2.5 years after he was placed here. Beautiful. Cave of Pakal. In the mountain of Pakal.
Exactly.
On the sarcophagus lid is a great carving of Pakal frozen in the moment of his death, falling into the cave of the underworld as he starts his journey. And then Alfonso gives me the most intriguing piece of the puzzle about Pakal's pyramid. The Maya believed that his spirit would be carried from his sacred mountain cave by a river. Pakal's journey to the afterlife was a journey down a subterranean river. But there's no river at Palenque. Alfonso tells me this was a river in the spirit world, but that it was modeled on a real underground river elsewhere.
A place where the water comes out.
The Yucatan contains the world's largest system of natural wells and underground rivers. There are over 1,000 wells and hundreds of miles of water-filled tunnels running beneath the limestone surface of the peninsula. They're called cenotes, and there's nothing like them anywhere else on the planet. I've got a hunch that Pakal's concept of the underworld might have been modeled on these real subterranean rivers. I'm not going to pass up the chance to explore these cenotes for myself, so I've teamed up with famous cenote diver Pablo Diaz, who's going to be my guide. The underwater world of the cenotes is one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. The water is 75 degrees and crystal clear. There are stalactites everywhere. And beyond them, tunnels and caves stretch away in every direction into the blackness. Only about 1/3 of the huge cenote system has ever been explored. That's because it's so dangerous. Many experienced divers have drowned in these flooded tunnels. Since I don't want to be one of them, Pablo and I swim back towards the cenote entrance by a different route. The network of tunnels seems to be endless, and away from the light, they all look the same. I can see how easy it would be to get lost down here. The experience of the cenotes is eerie and awe-inspiring. This is stunning. The second you dive in, you're transported to another world. Clearly, the Maya did not have scuba gear. But even if one just held their breath and dove into the cenotes and saw these caverns and the caves behind them and the tubes that interconnect them, there's something there. There's a sense of being transported to another place. To investigate Maya beliefs about the cenotes further, I've come to the Maya city of Chichen Itza in the Yucatan. Chichen Itza flourished between the 8th and 12th centuries. It sits squarely on top of the cenote system, and I've heard it was an important ritual center. I'm on my way to meet archaeologist Rafael Cobos, who I hope can tell me more.
Rafael? Hi. Mucho gusto, I'm Josh.
Welcome.
What was it about Chichen Itza that was so important?
At Chichen Itza, we have the sacred cenote.
Why was the cenote considered sacred?
It's the entrance to the underworld. Pilgrims came during pre-Hispanic times from all over the Yucatan Peninsula. For the pilgrims, that was the entrance to Xibalba, the underworld.
Wow. This is the sacred cenote.
That's right. This is the entrance to Xibalba.
It's beautiful.
The Great Cenote is stunning, but how do we know it was an entrance to Xibalba, the Maya underworld? It seems that from the time of the Spanish conquest of the Americas in the 16th century, stories had circulated of strange blood rituals performed here in which children were sacrificed to the gods of the underworld. To see if these stories were true, one of the very first archaeologists of the Maya, Edward Thompson, decided to dredge the cenote in 1904. He found lots of evidence of ritual offerings. At first, it was only objects, figures of gold and jade. But eventually, he found shocking confirmation of the old stories about the cenote. Human bones. Lots of them. The Maya of Chichen Itza were performing human sacrifices, offering their victims to the gods of Xibalba.
So the priests would actually throw bodies into the cenote?
That's right.
Where? Where would they do it?
From that temple, located on the southern edge,
The gruesome ceremonies at the Great Cenote are more evidence the Maya really did believe cenotes were entrances to the underworld, where the gods and demons of creation lived. But are these the actual subterranean rivers Pakal believed he would travel down after death? Now I really want to explore them more.
Where are we off to?
This site is called Temple of Doom.
Really?
I'm hot on the trail of the secrets of Maya pyramids. At the ruins of Palenque, I discovered that King Pakal believed his pyramid was a symbolic entrance to the Maya underworld. That led me to explore the stunning subterranean caves and rivers called cenotes, which the Maya believed were the real entrances to the underworld.
I understood that there's a parallel between pyramids and mountains, but I had no idea that the caves were so important. And going into Pakal's tomb, I got a sense of that this whole building was made just for this cave. And then to find out that the cave was only an access point to the rivers, and then the journey through the cenotes, just my whole concept of the Maya religion exploded.
The tourist beaches of the Yucatan Peninsula may seem like a strange place to search for the secrets of Pakal's passage to the afterlife. But beneath these beaches are the points where the freshwater cenote system meets the sea. One of them is the cenote they call the Temple of Doom. I'm hoping my guide, Pablo Diaz, and equally famous cave diver Gonzalo Arcila can tell me more.
I was wondering, I've heard that there are these tubes that go from the cenote bottoms all the way into the sea. And I was curious if there's one around here that we could explore, and two, if I could actually make that journey through the tube.
It's not a pretty dive.
and it's a technical dive.
I understand it might not be pretty, but I guess what I wanna explore is why the Maya thought this was a passage to the underworld. And I'm hoping that even if I can't see anything, seeing nothing would still be valuable because it would give me some insights into what that journey was like. How dangerous is
Because
this?
when the fresh water meets the salt water, that the visibility becomes completely blurred, and it just becomes very eerie, and it really takes your breath away for a minute.
It's quite a trick.
So I guess I don't understand the risks.
We consider it dangerous. The cave splits in several directions, and one mistake would lead to a very dramatic ending you don't want to have.
I'd be stuck, basically,
Yeah.
in a hole and I couldn't get out. So I would just stay there until I ran out of air.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't want that either. I've got a hunch that the passage from freshwater to saltwater may be the key to the Maya underworld. I'm determined to experience it, but first I need specialized training from Pablo. Learning to cave dive is all about learning to maneuver underwater in the dark. I put on a mask, blacked out with tape. Pablo spins me around to disorient me. Then, in total blackness, I have to secure my line and then find the lifeline that would guide me out of the cave. Without being able to see, it's a real challenge. On a lot of dives, finding that line would be the difference between life and death.
It's so beautiful down there. That was a great job. How did you think it was doing?
That's fine. That's fine. What I took wrong.
Yeah, you did a great job. Thank you. Okay, let's go for a dive.
Finally, the moment has come for my dive to the sea.
We'll see if it moves. But if it works, I come through and as I come up, I'm a god. Definitely. I'm officially reborn as a god. And the crew is aware of that. My combinations will be upgraded significantly.
I'm on my way to the cenote called the Temple of Doom, and the point where freshwater and saltwater meet. Divers call it the halocline. And I've heard a theory that the Maya believed the halocline was the meeting point between this world and the next. Could this possibly be true?
And we'll go to the halocline. When we go to the halocline, that's the transition to the salt water. Remember, visibility will be lost. And it's like a big psychedelic blur.
Yeah, this is a cenote. This is stunning.
Imagine walking in the jungle and suddenly finding out this.
One short leap in. Okay, let's go for it.
Pablo explains that at the Temple of Doom, there's a constant flow of water to and from the sea. The cenote system is like a giant lung, which breathes in salt water from the sea at high tides and exhales it at low tides. We hope the halocline is not too far away.
Ready for the plunge?
Ready for the plunge, baby.
Below the surface, tunnels extend for miles. We swim into the darkness. "15 minutes in and still no sign of the halocline. It's much farther away than we'd hoped, deep inside the dangerous blackness. We swim on. The stop sign is a warning. Beyond this, there are no lifelines. We're in uncharted territory. We're heading into the Maya underworld of the dead. Finally, we see the halocline. It's astonishing. An invisible barrier throwing everything out of focus. A shimmering wall of water. And then suddenly, we're through, into the crystal clear salt water of the sea. Could the Maya possibly have experienced this phenomenon? Perhaps some sacrificial victim survived to tell the tale. We'll never know, but it's an intriguing possibility. The halocline is the perfect image of the meeting of two worlds. The subterranean rivers of the Maya underworld are an unforgettable experience, but I still have a lot to find out about Pakal and his temple.
So 2 planes, and 6 hours later, we've made it to Guatemala City, and the adventure continues.
On the next leg of my journey, I join a magical ritual of the living Maya and risk my life again on a wild ride in Guatemalan whitewater. My investigation of Maya pyramids is turning into a real detective story. In my own way, I've been following the clues for days now. In Mexico, at Pakal's tomb in Palenque, I discovered a set of mysterious images, a passage to the underworld, mountains with caves and rivers inside them. These are the images which seem to have inspired Pakal's pyramid. But where do they come from? In the Yucatan, I discovered subterranean rivers and the extraordinary halocline, the underground meeting point of fresh and salt water, the perfect image of a portal to the underworld. But what about the mountains and the caves? With archaeologist Rafael Cobos at Chichen Itza, I try to connect the dots.
The connection is the creation myth, also known in the Maya as the Popol Vuh. The Popol Vuh says that bodies of water and temples, mountains, are always related with the underworld.
Rafael tells me the Popol Vuh is the Maya book of Genesis and one of the very few Maya texts to survive the Spanish conquest. For centuries, the Maya had carefully written down the stories of how their gods created the world. But in the 16th century, Spanish conquerors declared Maya religion to be the work of the devil and set out to destroy it. Priests consigned thousands of priceless Maya texts, the heart of Maya religion, to the bonfires of the Inquisition. Only a handful survived. One was the Popol Vuh. It was discovered in the highlands of Guatemala, in the town of Chichicastenango. Since it sounds like the Popol Vuh might have the answers I'm looking for, that's where I'm headed next.
In Chichen Itza, I learned that a lot of the answers to my questions about the Mayan pyramids might be found in a mysterious Mayan document called the Popol Vuh. That's why I've come to Chichicastenango in the highlands of Guatemala. This is where they found the Popol Vuh, and where I can uncover some of its secrets.
Chichicastenango is the heart of the living Maya world, and the heart of the living Maya religion. I think there's someone here who can help me understand the Popol Vuh. His name is Benicio Peña, and he's been living with the Maya in the highlands for years.
Benicio? Yeah? Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. This place is amazing. Yeah, it's beautiful. Let me show you around.
Yeah.
Okay, vamos.
I've never seen so much color in my life. Or so much religious devotion. Benicio knows more about the Maya religion than anyone in Chichicastenango today. Inside the church, signs of Maya worship and offerings are everywhere.
We have corn, we have avocados, we have prunes, incense.
This is the church where they found the
Yeah, actually, it was here right behind the main altar. That's what they found. That was at the beginning of the 18th century, 1701.
It seems we owe its survival to a Maya priest who is determined to preserve this priceless Maya knowledge for future generations. Taught to read and write by missionaries, he secretly wrote the story down. He hid it behind this altar, where it stayed for 150 years.
Well, because there was a lot of people who was hidden away from the conquistadores.
Really?
Because the conquistadores, they destroyed.
Its discovery opened a window into the heart of Maya belief, which today has been blended with Christianity to create a unique religion.
Benicio, teach me about the Popol Vuh.
Okay, the Popol Vuh is like the myth of the Genesis, the Maya Bible. That's what it was. It's about the origins, the beginning of time, and the creation of mankind.
Is there anything in the Popol Vuh that relates the Mayan beliefs of the underworld with caves and rivers?
Oh yeah.
Benicio tells me the Popol Vuh is the story of the gods who created the world. Two of them, the hero twins, descend into the underworld and discover the secrets of eternal life.
The first part, I mean, the Popol Vuh talks about the hero twins, Hunahpu and Xbalanque, going into the underworld, but the way they go is to a sacred mountain and a sacred cave, and then to a river.
Could this be the key I've been looking for? Benicio says that there's something he wants to show me at the ruins of Utatlan, a Maya city just outside of town.
Benicio, this place is beautiful, but how does it relate to the sacred caves that we're talking about?
The Mayans still use it today to perform ceremonies, and they've been tunneling right under this temple to make ceremonies.
So they're actually digging under this site in the front?
Yes.
Is that something I can see?
Yeah, let's go and see. I'll show you.
Lead the way.
It seems that for centuries, the Maya have been digging an artificial cave beneath the city's ruins. It's a sacred site where they conduct ceremonies all the time. There's one in progress when we arrive. A shaman friend of Benicio's is starting a ceremony just outside the mouth of the cave. He's asking for the blessing of the Maya gods.
He starts his ceremony here.
He begins here before he can go inside. He has to ask permission to the guardian spirit of the tunnel, so he can go in and do a ceremony inside.
Does he do the same ceremony inside?
It's different because basically inside they just offer incense and candles.
Finally, the moment arrives for the shaman and his wife to go into the sacred cave. It's extraordinary. A tunnel at least 100 yards long, stretching deep beneath the ancient city. If ever there was an entrance to the underworld, this is it. In silence, we follow them in. I'm struck by the beauty of the sacred space the Maya have created. For 500 years, they've kept their beliefs alive here. occurs to me, they've recreated the cave of the Popol Vuh, the cave where the world was born, and they're still worshiping in it today. As we leave the cave, another question occurs to me. Here, and at Palenque, we have a cave in a mountain. In the Yucatan, we have underground rivers. Is there a place where all three exist together? A cave and a river in a mountain.
Yeah, the Mayans believe there is a place in the high jungles of Guatemala. We call it Candelaria.
It's a real place.
Yeah.
Really? You gotta take me there.
Okay, let's go.
This is turning into an epic adventure, and there's more to come. We're heading for Guatemala's high jungle. My goal is the hidden spiritual birthplace of the Maya world, where I hope to finally discover the secrets of Maya pyramids. But the journey's going to be a wild one. What I found out so far about Maya pyramids is just amazing. In their pyramids, the Maya were recreating mountains with caves and rivers in them, entrances to the underworld. In Chichicastenango in the Guatemalan highlands, I finally found out why. The Maya Book of Genesis, the Popol Vuh, tells how the world was born from a cave and river in a mountain. In the ritual at the man-made cave outside Chichicastenango, I realized that for millennia, wherever they could, the Maya have sought to recreate that sacred space. Even more amazing, I've discovered that the sacred mountain, cave, and river of the Popol Vuh were based on a real place, Candelaria.
To see this cave and to see a prayer happening there, and to understand that this cave is built on the model of a real cave, which is not far from here, this makes me want to get there like now.
The highlands are laced with rivers, and one of them is taking us down into the high jungle. The caves of Candelaria are our goal, but first, we're going to visit the Maya ruins of Cancuén, the only Maya city with no pyramid. Paradoxically, it may hold the key to all Maya pyramids. I'm excited because Cancuén is the site of one of the most famous Maya archaeologists alive today, Arthur Demarest. While Benicio plans our next river trip, I go in search of Arthur. They call him the Indiana Jones of Maya archaeology. I'm told Arthur has uncovered entire Maya cities, faced down tomb robbers, and received countless death threats, many at gunpoint.
I gotta get the photos. I'm supposed to look like him. Every time they come, they're disappointed. I'm sorry. I do what I can.
Arthur is eccentric, brilliant, and he talks nonstop.
They're gonna start making all my colleagues do it, and my colleagues are gonna hate me. But
he probably knows more about pyramids and Maya kings than anybody alive.
I'm gonna forget. And
as I walk around the city with Arthur, I'm struck by something. There are palaces, but no pyramids. Cancuén was a spiritual power center, but there are no temples or pyramids. Why?
well, everything in this place can be explained in terms of the fact that there are no temples here. The core of every Maya site is this collection of temples. Maybe they've got natural temples, the real Huitz. And these are the temples of the site. Huitz means a sacred hill with a cave in it. We are at the base of the highlands here, where the Chinaha Mountains slam into the rainforest. I mean, it is a boom, just like that. And the rivers that are coming off the highlands, because these are very soft limestone mountains, they don't go over, they go through, and they come shooting out. We have them all over here. So this site doesn't need temples. They got the real thing.
So you're saying that the people at Cancuén didn't need to build temples because they already had them here?
Yes, they had them.
And what was
And they're much better. The ones that God makes are much better. I mean, these things are awesome. So that explains everything about this site. Because the temples here, they're caves, and you go explore them, you find the stuff from Conquan, the offerings, you find that's where they're doing the religion.
Is there any reason for these caves to be considered a path to the underworld?
Yes.
Here, that's important here as well.
Oh, no, it comes,
Okay, we'll stop it there, because I do want to have time to hand back your exam. And there's just a little bit more, and we'll watch that on Tuesday, and then, start that discussion. So actually, I'll keep these until